Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for questions several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send direct messages to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. One of those names is Technical Help, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSWebinar, that's NCCPSWebinar. If you miss part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available shortly after the webinar on the NCCPS webinar page. And watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now to our presentation. Students report that after being arrested or receiving a citation, is one of the most negative consequences of drinking. We thus have a target of opportunity when the student's motivation to change is high. Motivational interviewing by a police officer can therefore be effective at fostering long-term behavioral change and lowering high-risk drinking behavior. Today we're going to hear about motivational interviewing from the man who literally wrote the book on the topic, Dave Closson. Dave is an associate with CAPT, the Center for the Application of Preventive Technologies, which is part of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the Department of Health and Human Services. In that capacity, he provides targeted training and technical assistance to institutes of higher education around the country. He was previously the assistant director of the Illinois Higher Education Center, where he provided professional development, consultation, and training throughout the state of Illinois. Dave previously worked as crime prevention officer, field training officer, and patrol officer for the Eastern Illinois University Police Department. He also spent time as a corrections officer and served as a sergeant in the Illinois Army National Guard, from which he was deployed as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. After spending a year in Iraq with his infantry unit and his recon team, he was awarded 2 Army Commendation Medals and a Combat Infantryman's Badge. Dave is a graduate of Eastern Illinois University, where he received a BS in Biology and an MS in Technology Training and Development. His master's work focused on motivational interviewing for campus police. He was the university's commencement speaker in 2013, discussing his approach to campus policing, motivational interviewing, and his master's degree research. Last but certainly not least, he's the author of the book, Motivational Interviewing for Campus Police. David Closson, thank you for your service, and welcome to Campus Public Safety Online.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedule to attend today's webinar. And thank you to the National Center for Campus Public Safety for hosting today's webinar. And before I jump in too deep into the content, I'd like to take a moment and take everybody on a virtual ride-along back to the very first time I used motivational interviewing out on patrol. Now picture this. It's a Friday evening and you receive a call for service at one of the campus residence halls. Somebody's been smoking cannabis in their residence hall room. It's a fairly common call, unfortunately. So as I'm heading to this location, I'm getting some background on the particular room. It's one that's already known to the police department and to the housing staff. They'd been there the previous 2 weekends, and they came up empty-handed. So coming there for the 3rd time now, I thought, what better time to try a new approach and see if it works? Because the traditional approach didn't. So I knocked on the door and I introduced myself to that student. And then I asked if I could come in and talk to him. And I simply began using motivational interviewing, asking about his smoking behavior and what were his motivating factors. Why does he smoke? What are some of the good things? He shared with me that his grandmother, who raised him, was in bad health. And between that and the stress from school, he would smoke to cope, to deal with his stress. And in talking to him and reflecting on those and things that really care and matter, he then realized that getting caught by campus police and the housing staff every week for smoking cannabis might not really be helping out his stress, and that maybe he needs to cut back or change his smoking behavior. And by the end of the conversation, he said, "Hey, Officer Closson, thanks for taking time to talk to me. Let me help you out." He gets up, walks over to his pantry, pulls out a box of Lucky Charms, and then in that box, he pulls out his cannabis. That was his hiding spot, and why everybody came up empty-handed. But as we were leaving the residence hall that day, the area coordinator, Jess, pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Dave, I've never seen an officer take the time to talk to a student and actually care about them the way you did. That was awesome." And to me, that was a turning point. That was when the light went off and I knew that this had to be a thing, that this really can make a positive impact in the lives of students on campuses. So thanks for going on that ride along with me. Let's go ahead and keep that in mind as we move forward in today's webinar. Now, Steve did a wonderful job sharing my background. I wanted to just touch on one thing, though, regarding that last bullet from my time in the Army. When we were patrolling the streets of Iraq, one of the things that led to our battalion being so successful was the ability to build a collaborative working relationship with the Iraqi civilians. When they realized we were there to help them, they began to help us. And I carried that lesson forward with me to patrolling as a police officer, and that's what set the foundation for my student-centered approach to policing. Now, just like any trip or any journey, I like to start out with a roadmap. I want to know where I'm going. And that's very common with police officers across the country. They want to know where they're going. So first, we're going to start with why. Why should we put motivational interviewing on our duty belt as a part of our toolkit? Then I'm going to break down what is motivational interviewing, or MI. And then lastly, I'll share some strategies and ways I used it and other officers are still using motivational interviewing on patrol. So do better talk. That's a phrase that I coined, and I like to compare it to any interaction with a student. Whether you pulled them over for speeding, or you stopped them for an open container, or you're at the residence hall room because they were smoking cannabis in their room. It's that last little 5-minute parting words that almost every single officer will have with a student. I noticed some of those officers would lecture, and some of them would scold or threaten. If you don't straighten up, you're going to end up in jail, or this is going to cost you a lot of money. But then others might talk like a disappointed parent. "I'm not mad at you, but I'm disappointed in you. You can do better." Regardless, I saw the impact that these do better talks really could have on helping a student change their behavior. And I wanted to find the most effective way to have this do better talk. Which way worked best? Lecturing, threatening, or just listening? So that's what brought me to motivational interviewing. Well, as a crime prevention officer, I was invited to co-teach some alcohol sanction classes for the Student Conduct Office. In order to do those, I went to a couple training workshops, and they told me about this thing called motivational interviewing. I'd never heard of it before, but I jumped right in and I tried it. So much that I was one of the role players for the training workshops demonstration. I got to see what MI was like from the perspective of a student. I thought that was pretty cool. And as I was having these conversations with students in the sanctioning classes, they really enjoyed having such a collaborative, open conversation with a police officer. They'd never had something like that before, and they enjoyed it. And that's what pushed me to take it out on patrol. Rather than wait for the students to get caught and come to the student conduct office, let's take MI to the streets, take it out to them. Now, a snapshot definition of motivational interviewing. It's a directive, student-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping students explore and resolve ambivalence, those mixed feelings of, maybe I shouldn't drink so much, but then again, I kind of like it. So what's happening on campus? We're going to start there because that's where we're going to take this. We're going to take a deeper look into what's going on campus and how does MI fit in to helping and make things better. I wanted to just briefly look at students' alcohol consumption. And these numbers come from the Core Alcohol and Drug Survey. Now look at the amount of drinking that goes on campus. Now think about what students think about drinking. More often than not, they're less concerned than community members. In certain social groups with high drinking reputations are even seen with a higher social status. And some level of consequences are tolerable. And those students are more accepting of risky behavior. And more often, they consider drinking as part of the normal behavior. Regardless, college students consume alcohol more often than not in a relatively high-risk manner. And we are often the ones, campus police, that end up having to deal with their behavior. And a quick look at college students' reported drug use. Same thing, these are from the Core Institute. 32% have used marijuana in the past year. And then we'll skip ahead to 11.9% have used an illegal drug other than marijuana in the past year. And then 6.2% are current users of illegal drugs other than marijuana. So students are still out there using drugs, and these behaviors are leading to those students having negative consequences related to their behavior. Now, 32.2% of students reported some form of public misconduct as a result of drinking or drug use. And that public misconduct, that's when the police officers are going to get called. We're going to have to go deal with that. Then almost 22% experienced some kind of serious personal problem during the past year as a result of their drinking or drug use. We need to make a difference in that. And what about crime on campus? How many calls for service are related to alcohol or drugs? How many of the crimes on campus are? Now, it didn't take me long at all when I was on patrol to realize the impact alcohol and drugs have on our job as a police officer. They really do deserve more attention. But ultimately, what is the biggest reason why we should incorporate motivational interviewing into our toolkit for patrol? What's these numbers right here from the NIAAA? 1,825 college students die from alcohol-related unintentional injuries. And 696,000 students are assaulted. Then 97,000 students report experiencing alcohol-related sexual assault. This is the biggest why. These numbers are unacceptable. And if by taking an extra 5, 10, or 15 minutes with an interaction with a student using motivational interviewing, we can have a positive impact on these numbers, we need to do that. Whether you'd like to admit it or not, you do care about the student's safety and well-being, or else you wouldn't put on that uniform every day. And that brings us back to the do better talk. The power of a do better talk, taking that extra 5, 10, or 15 minutes really can have a positive impact and change somebody's life just by talking to them. I like to share this quote from the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, Executive Institute. While law enforcement may be resistant to the idea of counseling, in all practicality, that often ends up being the law enforcement role in many situations. I often hear, we're not counselors. It's not our job. This is too touchy-feely for me. I'm just there to write tickets. But in all reality, we fall into that role. So why not learn a skill to help us be more effective in that role? And that's what brings us to motivational interviewing. I'd like to pause momentarily to see if there's any questions out there.
Thanks, Dave. You are listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Today we're hearing from David Closson, and we are hearing about motivational interviewing for campus police. If you have questions or comments for Dave, type them into that line at the bottom of the pod on the left side of your screen that says questions and comments. We've got several breaks planned, and we will present those questions to Dave as we go along. Dave, what have officers' reactions been when learning about motivational interviewing?
Well, actually, it's a great question. It's been mixed results at first, but once they see it in action and they start trying it, they really jump on board and it makes sense. One particular story, I was a third officer responding to a residence hall room where my fellow officers had already gotten consent to search the room because they smelled the odor of cannabis. I simply stood out in the hallway with the students and I just hung out with them and I talked to them and I used motivational interviewing. And before you know it, they said, let me tell you where it's at, let's go get it. So I stuck my head in the door and said, hey guys, I've got something for you. And when we walked in there as a group and they just went to the drawer and pulled it out and handed it over and said, here you go, those two officers were on board right then and there. Said, this stuff does work. Great question.
I'm intrigued by the quote on your screen about counseling. Can you say a little more about how officers react to sort of being pushed more in the direction of counseling when quite clearly there is that resistance?
Yes. Actually, if we look at motivational interviewing as a communication skill rather than we're here to perform counseling, then they're more apt to embrace it because as law enforcement, we rely so heavily on strong interpersonal communication skills. I mean, verbal judo really set the foundation for police communication. And I like to say motivational interviewing sits right on top of verbal judo, whereas verbal judo will de-escalate and gain compliance and cooperation. And when it comes time to take the conversation to the next level, to really talk about that long-term change so you're not back responding to the same call the next weekend, that's where motivational interviewing sits in. And as we get a little bit farther in the webinar, we'll be able to highlight how verbal judo sets up motivational interviewing because they're both built on the same foundation, same style of interaction.
Well, as you can see, we've got a comment in the chat pod from someone who's looking forward to understanding more about your approach and method. So without any further ado, why don't I let you continue with your presentation?
All right, sounds great, and you're in the right spot. We'll get right to that. So now moving into the second part where we're going to talk about what is motivational interviewing. But here's the definition. But essentially, you can change that person-centered to student-centered. It's simply a student-centered form of guiding to elicit and strengthen motivation for change. Essentially, it's a way of talking to people that builds their internal motivation to change. You'll use questions and statements to think and talk in a positive, forward direction. The objective is not to solve the problem or even essentially develop a plan. The goal is to help that person resolve their ambivalence, develop some momentum, and truly believe that change is possible. Motivational interviewing is built on collaboration. You want to approach it as the students are their own experts. We don't know them better than they know themselves. You want to create an atmosphere that is conducive rather than coercive, and really think partnership. You're there to come alongside the student. And then it's also built on evocation. The students have the knowledge and they have the motivation to change within. It's our job to help evoke this motivation and strengthen that motivation so they will then change their own high-risk drinking behaviors. And then lastly, motivational interviewing is based on autonomy or self-direction. The student has the right and the capacity to make that change. We need to respect their autonomy and support and strengthen that autonomy. Then here's just a brief list of who is currently using motivational interviewing on campus. And think about those slides that I showed that show the number of college students that reported drinking in the past year or in the past 30 days. Almost all college drinkers will interact with people who are concerned about their health and safety, such as the student conduct, the medical staff, the housing staff. Now, in contrast, very few of those college drinkers are referred to counselors who specialize in alcohol or drug abuse treatment. This means that more non-specialists will ultimately talk with a large number of college drinkers than specialized counselors will. Unfortunately, there's good evidence that shows individuals with relatively little counseling training can have a positive impact on college students' drinking behavior. These are the four main principles of motivational interviewing. The first one, express empathy. We're related back to verbal judo. And for those that have read it, you know that Doc Thompson said that empathy is the most powerful word in the English language. And it is. Showing some empathy, understanding that student's perspective is the foundation for both verbal judo and for motivational interviewing. And that second one, develop discrepancy. For motivational interviewing, that sounds like what are some of the good and the not so good things of your drinking or your drug use. Police officers already do this on patrol. They spot discrepancies when they're looking to see if somebody's telling the truth or if they're lying. And then the next one is roll with resistance. That right there is verbal judo at its finest, your strip phrases. You're rolling with resistance. You're not going to take them head on. You're going to deflect those insults and you're just going to keep moving forward. But then lastly, that support the self-efficacy. That's the new one that we're adding in to the skill set. Really building up those students' confidence in that they have the ability to make a change. Then next, we'll move into the process. Engaging, building rapport and trust. You do the exact same thing in verbal judo. Officers have these skills and they're already doing these. During the engaging process, your goal is to create that collaborative working relationship with the student. You'll work to make the student feel more comfortable and like they're an active participant in the conversation. And the next step, focusing. This is a part of the process where you'll guide the student in an effort to clarify the picture of where they're headed. You can use this step to focus on specific steps they can take to get where they want to be, or you can use focusing to really hone in on what they care about most. You'll want to find a balance between actively directing the student and allowing the student to lead the conversation. Then when you move forward to the evoking, you'll work to bring to mind the student's values and goals. You want to help them recall past experiences where they've been successful and reflect on what was working well for them. You'll use open-ended questions to evoke what is important to the students And then as you talk about what's important to them, you'll move forward into the planning process. So you know what's important to you, let's see how we can get there. And during the planning process, the final step, this is where the students will begin change talk. They're talking about a desire to change their behavior. And this is where you'll work to help them form a plan of action. And a quick note, people are much more likely to follow through with a plan that they've said aloud and they've told it to somebody else. Well, although these steps seem linear, it's important to stress that it's a fluid process. You won't necessarily go through each stage progressively. In fact, during a successful change conversation, I've often found myself circling back in order to move forward. And that's okay. That's just a part of the process. Then motivational interviewing is built on the stages of change theory. And there's just 4 main insights that I would like to share from the stages of change. The first being that change is a process. It occurs over time. Think about the New Year's resolution. Leading up to January 1st, you're going to be thinking about your New Year's resolution. You're going to be contemplating what change you want to make. Then you might do some preparation, buy a gym membership, or go buy some new running shoes. And then you take action. It's a process, and it's not going to happen overnight. But then secondly, the stage at which a person finds himself will determine the approach needed to help them. With most interactions on campus, especially out on patrol, the students will be in the very early stages of change, pre-contemplation or contemplation most likely. And so there, the goal of our interaction is to increase their motivation and prepare them to change. And the third insight is that relapse is normal. For many people, it will be a process of trial and error before they finally reach success. And then lastly, because you care, you'll want to see the student progress through all of the stages. But it's a more realistic goal to simply raise their motivation to change. Now, the fundamental skills. Knowing how law enforcement, we love our acronyms. So we've got one right here, down the left-hand side of this graphic. OARS, O-A-R-S. And with the open-ended questions, those will help you understand the student's point of view and encourage the student to share their feelings about the situation. And those open-ended questions are really going to facilitate the dialogue and keep things moving forward. Then affirmations. When this is done right, you're going to support their self-efficacy. You're going to strengthen their confidence and their motivation to change. And it really promotes the idea that change is possible. And reflections. These are your way to check in with the student to ensure you know what's going on, rather than assuming you understand what they mean. These are what are going to take the conversation to that deeper level. When I'm doing a training with law enforcement, we spend a lot of time working on reflections, as it's not a natural skill. This is what's going to make things feel touchy-feely. This is what's going to feel like counseling. But once you start using them, you can see how they really keep the conversation going forward and engage the student in critical thinking. Then lastly, summarizing. You're going to use these every day when you're handling a call. But now you can use summaries to really help the student understand the problem more clearly, to get them a big picture perspective on their behavior rather than looking at things individually, one item at a time. You can also use these summaries to really guide the student to consider change. You'll highlight that ambivalence. And you said you like these good things, but you also said all of these negative things or not so good things. And ultimately, the goal is to have more open-ended questions than closed-ended questions. And you want to have more reflections than open-ended questions. You want the student to do the majority of the talking. And change talk. I had mentioned this before. And just like with the ORS acronym, we've got another one. Along the bottom of this graphic, you've got the desire, ability, reason, and need. That spells out darn. That's how you can remember change talk. This will be when a student starts expressing one of these, a desire or a reason that they might need to make a change. Or they say that, I do have the ability, I can do this. You're going to use the ORs to keep the conversation going and elicit this change talk. This is the goal that we're working towards. So officers already use ORs on a daily basis. They already use the fundamental process. So now, rather than focusing on determining if they're lying or not, focus that ambivalence and those skills to elicit this change talk. And then when you start hearing this change talk, you'll work to affirm it and support it to build their confidence and their motivation to change. Then another acronym, CAT, Commitment, Action, and Taking Steps. You've got your darn CAT. These are preparatory statements, so where they're already taking action towards making a change. Now, the New Year's resolution, you went out and got the gym membership, or you bought the new running shoes. You're already moving towards that change. And you want to affirm those statements. And then sustain talk. I put resistance there because for law enforcement, that's what it's going to look and feel like. It'll feel like resistance. You want that student to go from point A to point B. But when that student is saying, I don't really see a reason to change. I'm okay with the way things are. That simply means they're not ready to change and they want to keep their current behavior. And with that, I'd like to just take a quick moment. We've run through what motivational interviewing is, gave you a good, solid foundation. I'm curious if we have some more questions.
And thanks, Dave. We do have some questions. Keep those questions coming, by the way. We've got several more breaks planned. Do officers that use MI find they have a better relationship with students on their campus?
Yes, very much so. Having that collaborative working relationship, we're here to help you, really sets the foundation. It's a great way to work as a community police officer. You're not there to confront. You don't want the students to dig in their heels or argue with you. So they're really going to build a better relationship with those officers. And towards the end, when I share some ways to use it on patrol, I'll have a few specific examples to where I used it while community policing and just building relationships with the student population. Wonderful question.
Does MI work better with some personality types than others?
Yes, and that is a very excellent question. Normally I would touch on this later on, but I'll go ahead and talk about it right now. When the crisis intervention training first came out, it was said you really only wanted a small percentage of your officers trained in CIT. That being, it's not a good fit for every person because of their personality types. Some are good at it, some aren't. And I completely understand that. It's the same way with motivational interviewing. But one little caveat to that is now a lot of departments are wanting almost every officer trained in CIT because what they saw was even if they weren't doing textbook CIT skills, it changed the way they interacted with the individuals. And it's the same way with motivational interviewing. Even if the officers aren't doing textbook MI, if they just embrace the spirit and they take that collaborative approach, it's going to completely change the way that they patrol. And that will have a positive impact on the relationships with students. Wonderful question.
Do officers say that using motivational interviewing makes them appear weaker?
Well, I get that question every once in a while too. And essentially the results speak for themselves. When the students would rather talk to you than an officer that's being stern, those stern officers realize you catch more bees with honey. Now, if you can have a friendly, positive conversation with a student and gain compliance and cooperation and really talk about change, then I don't care what they think. And one little additional note, though, is this isn't a panacea. MI is just a tool set, just a skill to add to your tool belt that's not meant for every situation. Sometimes, for lack of a better way to say it, you need to just shut up and be the police.
Let me squeeze one more question in here, and it's a clarification on the earlier question. The question about personality types, the asker says he meant the personality type of the students.
Okay. Wonderful clarification. Uh, with with students, actually, I was doing a training at the University of Illinois, and one of the officers said, you know, this seems like it would be a great fit for this generation of students because they like to talk about themselves. They don't care about who I am, what training I've been to. They really don't want to hear about that. They want to talk about themselves. And granted, it's kind of a blanket statement, but this fits right into that because the students are the ones doing the talking, not the officers. So in that sense, it fits very well with our new generation of students. As far as personality types, a lot of it will depend on the nature of the call or the incident. But it really does fit very well because through the engaging process, you're building rapport with them. You're telling them, I hear you, I'm listening, and what you're saying does matter. And regardless of their personality types, often it's hard to be mad at somebody that understands you and approaches things and is such an active listener and empathetic listener.
Thanks, Dave. We do have more questions there, but we're going to save them to the next break. We won't lose any of them, and those of you who do have questions or comments, type them right in there, and we will present them at the next chance we get. So, Dave, back to your talk.
Wonderful. Thanks for all the questions. I love them. Keep them coming. All right, we're going to go ahead and shift into the last portion of the webinar, and we're going to talk about motivational interviewing out on patrol. But before I start talking about police officers, I'd like to just add a little bit about this research. Now, this was done with EverFi and Union College. They trained their RAs in motivational interviewing. I like to compare RAs to campus police, but I can still remember when I was a freshman living on campus, and that RA was the person that was going to get me in trouble. They were out to get me for being too loud during quiet hours or having too many people in my room at once. But what they found is that when the RAs would sit down and have a motivational interviewing style conversation, the overall resident satisfaction with the staff increased by 15%. They liked them more when they used motivational interviewing. I don't know a police department out there that wouldn't love to see a 15% increase in satisfaction with their department just by changing the way that they talk to the students. Then on this graphic also, I'd like to call your attention to the bottom right. So the number of money billed to students for vandalism and room damage dropped by 59%. A lot of those vandalism calls would also involve law enforcement. Had a major drop. Now on YouTube, Union College also has a short little video that's about 5 minutes long where they interview the RAs that took part in this research. And it's really great to listen to them talk. And they really explain that they helped those students, and those students really felt comfortable coming to those RAs for help and advice and guidance, and that they had a lot less conduct violations by simply using motivational interviewing. So I like to compare RAs to the police officer because a lot of students think that we're the ones that are out to get them. We're going to be the ones to catch them underage drinking or with the open containers. They have a very similar perspective, at least from my time as a freshman on campus. So now let's move forward. Motivational interviewing in campus police. I break it down to 4 main benefits for officers using motivational interviewing out on patrol. And those are listed here on this graphic. And we're going to break down each one of those individually and discuss what I mean by them, such as the motivation is already elevated. During the introduction, Steve had mentioned that students report being arrested or receiving a citation as one of the most negative consequences related to drinking. Now, what this means to me is that their motivation is already elevated then when they're having an interaction with a police officer. They're thinking about their behavior. I like to compare this to speeding because that's something most people can really relate to. When you're driving down the road, regardless of if you're speeding or not, and you see a squad car up ahead, you're going to look down at your speedometer. You're probably even going to take your foot off of the accelerator and slow down a little bit. Even if you weren't speeding, by the mere presence of a police officer, you are automatically thinking about your behavior. You're thinking about changing your behavior. And it's the same impact when you're out on campus. I don't know how many times I've been on foot patrol and I would just talk to students that were out walking. They were of age to consume alcohol. Yes, they might have had a little bit, but not too much. As soon as they're around a police officer, they get stiff. They act very sober, very quick, like they're going to get in trouble. So what better time to have a conversation about changing their behavior than when they're already thinking about it? They're already contemplating changing their behavior. Oh, maybe I shouldn't have drank so much. Maybe I should cut back, rather than wait till later down the road and then talk to them about it. And that leads us into the next one, the life goes on time gap. When you make an arrest, they'll get a court date, just like when you issue a state citation. And here in Illinois, when you issue a citation, you give them a court date that is minimum 30 days out. So it's going to be 30 days before they even have to appear in court, and even longer before they receive their sanction to really start talking about their behavior and start talking about changing it. Now on our campus, when we're issuing a student conduct code citation rather than a state citation, it would be a week to maybe 2 weeks before that student even went into the student conduct office to talk about what happened and then to determine the appropriate sanction. Then it might be a couple more weeks before they even get into that sanction class. So that time gap right there, it can be 30 days, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a month before that student really is able to have a guided conversation about changing their behavior. Life has gone on. Now, that Friday night when they were receiving that underage drinking student conduct code violation or a state citation, they might have thought it was the end of the world. They were thinking about, man, I really messed up. I need to make a change. But then Saturday night went by and nothing happened. The next week, the next weekend went by and nothing happened. And so their motivation is going to slowly back off. Just like when you're speeding, you'll slow down and maintain the speed limit for a few miles, but because nothing happened and nobody really talked to you about the importance of driving the speed limit, you're going to bump your speed right back up. So we need to close that life goes on time gap by just a little bit of motivational interviewing out in the field. On patrol, you can create that jump start to change. And that leads us to the next one. And this graphic should look familiar, the stages of change. Creating that jump start to change. When a student is interacting with a campus police officer, regardless of they're getting a citation or not, they're likely already thinking about their behavior, just as I had mentioned. They'll be contemplating it. They'll be thinking, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have had those extra shots. And so when the officer uses some motivational interviewing to create that jump start to strengthen their motivation and talk about that behavior change, they'll likely move a little bit farther along in the change process. And then when they enter the student conduct office that next week or the week after, they've been contemplating this behavior change. And that student conduct officer will use motivational interviewing as well. And then when they enter the sanctioning class, those are most often based on motivational interviewing. So they will receive consistent motivational interviewing, which will ideally and hopefully move them farther along in the change process. They receive consistent support and motivational interviewing throughout the entire change process. And then lastly, we had already kind of talked about this one because of some of the great questions, but it's a style of interaction. I'd said even if an officer isn't doing textbook motivational interviewing, if they just embrace the spirit of collaboration and autonomy and evocation and really focus on that student-centered aspect and be active listeners and use empathy, they're going to value diversity. They're going to manage the dynamics of difference. They're really going to get to know and learn about the diversity and the cultural context of the students that they're serving on campus. And this fits very well into the new generation of students like we had already covered. It can literally change the way officers are policing on campus. And now, here are a few ways that myself and then other officers are using motivational interviewing on patrol. Well, the first being drug task force officers. This is a fun one. I didn't see this one coming right away. There is a drug team on a rather large campus, and what they do whenever they make an arrest, rather than try to fix or flip the student, get them to give up their dealer or do a control buy, those officers will take the entire first hour and just talk to that student. They'll get to know that student and really use motivational interviewing to understand what's important to that student and how they can best help that student overcome their drug misuse. And if they feel that that student is in a good spot and won't go down the wrong road again, then they'll work with them. But if they feel like there's a chance that that student could go back to using drugs again, they won't work with them because they don't want to put them in that situation. By using motivational interviewing, that led them to their largest drug case in campus history. A freshman came in and he got into some hard drugs, cocaine and ecstasy, and he got caught. So they used motivational interviewing and they were just talking to him, and he shared that, he was a good kid in high school. He got to college and he just let loose. And then with that, he started sharing that, he was really concerned about his parents, what they were going to think. He didn't want to let them down because his grades were starting to slip. He didn't want to get kicked out of school. That's what was important to him. By the end of their conversation, they then just said, hey, thanks for talking to us. Left it at that. The student then leans forward and says, hey, here's my cell phone. Here's 4 different dealers bringing in large quantities. Here's when they come in, how they operate. Here's how to contact them. And that led them to the biggest case. That student wanted to help them so other students didn't go down the same road. And then crime prevention officers. This is how I used it. In the student standards or student conduct classes, then I would also incorporate it into my alcohol prevention programming and my presentations. Like I said before, the students have the knowledge. They know the safe drinking tips. So I would ask questions and just lead them in a conversation to where they would share the good and the not so good things about drinking. With that, it became a very engaging and student-driven presentation to where they really enjoyed it rather than just lecturing. And then community policing, we touched on this earlier. One specific story that I remember is working the gate at a football game. There were 2 student employees that were collecting tickets, and I was there just to be the statue in case something happened and I needed to step up. But instead, I had a conversation with the students, and one of those students was bragging about having the nickname Giraffe because when he gets drunk, he's very wobbly on his feet. So that led right into an MI conversation. We had a genuine conversation about drinking and some of the negative consequences related to it. So here I was working a football game with 2 students. We had a real conversation, not just small talk. And it helped change those students' perspectives to where they wanted to cut back on their drinking behavior because they didn't want to fall down because there's a giraffe and get hurt. And we had talked about crisis intervention already, so I won't go back over that one. So we're also getting close toward the end of this webinar. Then alcohol enforcement officers. There's a team of officers that do controlled party dispersals. And those officers would love to be able to sit down and have those motivational interviewing conversations, but they're pressed for time. They have to process those students and get them on their way. So what they've done is they'll give those students one of their business cards, and they'll say, hey, come on down tomorrow and just talk to me. We'll have a conversation. Right now, this is an ordinance violation or state citation. They don't make any promises about ripping up tickets. They just tell them, here's where we're at, come talk to me. And that gives them the opportunity to sit down and have those MI conversations with students. And then one more that's not on this list, I was speaking at a conference out in DC this summer, and one of the officers said, hey, I'm going to take this back and I'm going to use it on my gang unit to help working with individuals, the gang members, to really strengthen their support and their motivation to change their behavior and to get out of those gangs. I thought that was cool. The more officers are learning how to apply motivational interviewing, the more creative they are at using it on patrol. So there's a lot of ways you can do it, and it is just a good natural fit, and it leads for very student-centered policing and very forward-focused and positive interactions with the students. And in my mind, that is a win-win, because that will lead to safer campuses and students suffering and experiencing less amount of those negative alcohol-related consequences. The biggest why, as far as we should incorporate this into our toolkit. I would love to field some more questions if there's any out there.
We do have quite a few, Dave. Nikki Barone, now you've touched on this a bit, I think, but she's asking you to go a bit deeper, I think. Will you be giving examples of the types of open-ended questions or how this might flow in a real conversation?
Yes. It can be tricky because MI, motivational interviewing, isn't necessarily a script. It's going to be different every single time because it's so much based on what the student says. But a lot of times, I'll start out asking about the quantity and frequency of their use, and whatever that conversation might be. If it's an enforcement situation, it might be, how often do you go out and drink? Or how often do you find yourself smoking cannabis? Tell me what your cannabis use looks like. And that is very open-ended, so they can just talk about it. Then that will set the stage, and I'll ask them, what are some of the good things about drinking? And by asking them that, the good things first, really lowers their defenses. Like, hey, this cop just asked me what I like about drinking. That never happens. But they'll produce that list. And then you flip it and you ask them, what are some of the not so good things? And again, that student will list those items. And you'll work them for some more. What else? What are some other things? So here they've just made a list of the good and not so good. Most often the not so good list is longer. And then you can reflect back and say, well, tell me about a time other than right now where your drinking behavior has caused a problem for you. So they just made a negative list. Now they're going to talk about a time when it caused a problem. Whatever that problem might be, they didn't do their homework, they were hungover, they blacked out, or they got a DUI. So building on that, I like to follow up and say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very important, how important is it for you to make a change? When they give that number, regardless of what that number is, you can work with it. If it's a 5, if it's a 1, you can say, oh, that's interesting, you chose a 1. That shows there is some reasons for you to make a change. And you can have them visualize and look forward. What would it take to bump up 2 spots from a 1 to a 3, a 4, or a 5? And they'll start voicing those reasons to make that change. And you can affirm those and reflect those. So it's a very Cliff Notes what a conversation might look like. I hope that gives you a better idea, Nikki.
I think that's tremendous, Dave. Maggie McGifford wonders, have you used this technique when working on cases of sexual assault?
I have not, no. I never did handle any of those cases on our campus. I would be very interested, though, in talking with officers that do work on those cases and brainstorm to see how they might be able to incorporate this.
Robert Sommerfeld is diving a little deeper into an earlier question. Does the behavior change differ? Are things different between based on the age or generation of the students, millennial, Gen X, etc.?
We could have a long conversation about this. Excellent question, Robert. Essentially, change is going to be different for everybody regardless of their generation or their age. Now, what will really vary is their motivating factors. What is it that means the most to them? What do they value the most? And that's going to be different between the spectrum of all the college students to your non-traditional college students to your adults. The main thing is finding out what is motivating them or driving them to want to make that change and eliciting that change talks to support that change. As far as the research for motivational interviewing, I have not seen any yet that dives in and breaks down what it's like as far as different generations or ages. Wonderful question, though.
If a student is closed off and doesn't want to answer questions or talk with the officer or is stonewalling or other types of resistance, how do you handle that?
Well, actually, great question as well. When you get the resistance, and you still want to, if you still want to try motivational interviewing, because it's, again, it's just a tool and it's not meant for every situation. Sometimes you need to just move to different techniques, such as, verbal judo. But if they're really stonewalling, you can emphasize that in fact, it is up to you. It's your choice whether you would like to make a change or not. You know, that makes sense. You can also really reflect that resistance and say, so it seems to you that there's not a big reason for you to make this change. That tells the student that you get it, you understand their perspective, and you really are listening. That's going to really build that rapport and show that you care rather than you're there to just lecture that student. Now, hopefully, showing them that will get them to open up and then talk about change. But quite frankly, if they don't, then there's nothing you can do about it. You can't force somebody to change. So then you would go on and use a different technique, such as verbal judo, or pass it on down and explain it to the student conduct officer before their meeting. Because you can't force motivational interviewing. It's very student-driven and student-centered. That's a wonderful question.
And we've got time for one more. What opportunities are there for officers receiving training on motivational interviewing?
Yes, there of course is my book. Cheesy plug there. But the best way to learn motivational interviewing is in person. It's a skill that needs to be practiced, and you need that immediate guided feedback so you can get that sounding board that, am I doing this right? Or what is a different way I could word this? There are some online courses that will give you the good solid foundation, but that's going to rely on you going out on your own and really practicing to develop these skills. One thing that I like to add in my workshops is that reflections. It's one of the most challenging or unnatural skills, especially for law enforcement. So I like to challenge them to start incorporating reflections into their everyday conversations with their friends, their family, and loved ones. Use a reflection here or there and just get a feel for it. And as soon as they start doing that, they tend to see how powerful they really are. When you're with your significant other and you tell them, that was tough for you. That really stressed you out. You're reflecting their feelings, showing that you're being an empathetic listener will change that whole conversation and take it to that deeper level. And it's a great way you can just practice in everyday conversations.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker slides. The brief evaluation survey that I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. Mark your calendars for the next Campus Public Safety Online webinar, 2 to 3 p.m. on Thursday, October 20th. Our speaker will be Kathleen Basil, lead behavioral scientist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Her topic is applying the best available research evidence to build comprehensive strategies for sexual violence prevention. This webinar was originally scheduled for October 16th. You'll need to re-register even if you signed up for that earlier date. The registration URL is on your screen and clickable, or surf on over to the National Center webpage at nccpsafety.org. That's nccpsafety.org. The National Center for Campus Public Safety is bringing our extremely popular Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Investigation and Adjudication Institute to a number of locations from coast to coast. The curriculum includes modules on 15 topics, from the effects of trauma to a multidisciplinary approach to investigations, developed by subject matter experts in the areas of psychology and culture, sexual assault investigations, Title IX, and Clery. The schedule for upcoming dates is on your screen. For more details and to register, click the blue link or visit our webpage. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.